After a long day on the road, I finally stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of the sea air. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and the promise of the much-anticipated rest. We were standing in front of a beautiful white building right on the ocean front. My parents, like me, were filled with excitement, discussing how we would spend our vacation. The distant sound of the waves seemed to have the power to wash away any fatigue. "What do you think our rooms are like?" my mother asked with a smile, looking at the hotel as if seeing it for the first time. "Surely with an ocean view," my father replied, equally enthusiastic. I watched as the staff unloaded our suitcases. Mentally, I was already picturing a spacious room, a large balcony, and the endless blue sea stretching out before my eyes. We stepped into the cool lobby, and I could already imagine myself relaxing by the pool with a cocktail in hand. But as soon as we approached the reception desk, something went wrong. "I'm sorry, but there's an issue with your booking," the woman at the desk said, nervously glancing at the computer screen. "We only have 2 rooms left." "But we booked 3. My father objected, his voice tightening slightly. "We reserved 3 rooms, not 2. The woman looked at us apologetically but shrugged her shoulders. "I'm sorry, but that's all we have. There's only 1 double room left." "So someone will have to share a room." My mother sighed, casting a quick glance at me and Alex, my stepbrother. A wave of discomfort washed over me. I met Alex's gaze, and he just shrugged as if it didn't bother him much. Something inside me sank. Sharing a room with my brother? It felt strange, even though we always got along. "Looks like Alex and I will be sharing a room," I said casually, hoping my voice wouldn't betray my unease. "It's only temporary, I promise," my father added, clearly sensing the tension. "We'll figure something out tomorrow." We took the keys, and I felt as though something in the air had shifted. I walked into the room and immediately felt a strange mix of disappointment and awkwardness. The spacious room with its massive bed in the middle looked cozy, but the fact that Alex and I had to share it ruined everything. He followed behind me, tossed his backpack by the door, and glanced around. "Well, it's not so bad, I guess," he said calmly, as if this were just an ordinary room and not the place where we'd be sleeping in the same bed. "Yeah, a great place. Except for the fact that I gestured towards the bed but couldn't finish the sentence. He looked at me, then at the bed, and with a smirk said, "Hey, we're not kids anymore. We'll manage." I wanted to argue, but I decided to keep my thoughts to myself. Alex was right. We weren't kids anymore, and it was just a bed. But the thought of having to sleep so close to him still didn't sit well with me. We'd always been close like brother and sister, but this situation felt out of place. "I'll take that side," he said, pointing to the left side of the bed, trying to ease the tension. "You can have more space." I nodded silently, trying to hide my discomfort, and started unpacking. The evening passed in awkward silence. The TV was on in the background, but we barely spoke. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts. Everything seemed normal, yet completely abnormal. We both tried to act as if this was just a temporary, awkward inconvenience. When it was time to go to bed, I tried not to think about the fact that I was about to lie down in the same bed with him. Alex, as usual, was laid back. He changed into a t-shirt and shorts, casually lay down on his side, and closed his eyes right away. I slipped into bed on the other side, pulling the blanket up to my chin, trying to keep as much distance between us as possible. The room was quiet, the sound of the waves coming through the window, but I couldn't relax. I tossed and turned, changing positions, but sleep just wouldn't come. Alex seemed to fall asleep immediately, but the tension wouldn't leave me. It felt as if the walls were closing in and the space between us was shrinking with every passing minute. "You okay?" Alex asked softly from the darkness. "Yeah, I'm fine," I mumbled, trying to sound confident. "Just relax," he added, and I could hear a slight smile in his voice. "It's just a bed." But I couldn't forget that this just a bed was now ours to share. All day, we tried to avoid each other. Everyone got absorbed in their own activities. My parents enjoyed the beach, and Alex went for a run along the coast. I tried to distract myself by reading a book by the pool, but my thoughts kept returning to our shared room and the upcoming night. When we returned to the hotel, the day was winding down. We all had dinner at the hotel restaurant, and despite the delicious food, the tension between Alex and me only grew. When dinner was over, we slowly made our way back to the room. The entire walk up the stairs was filled with awkward silence. As soon as we entered, I felt a rising anxiety. Alex was the first to take off his shoes, then sat on the edge of the bed, stretching tiredly. "You're probably going to shower, right?" he asked, looking at me with mild indifference, though there was something in his voice that stirred a strange feeling inside me. "Yeah," I replied, avoiding his eyes as I grabbed my pajamas and headed to the bathroom. Hot water poured over me, but it did nothing to relax me. I felt tense, and it only made things worse. At one point, I thought I heard someone knocking on the door, and I turned abruptly toward the exit. But there was nothing. It was just my imagination, wound up by strange thoughts. I wrapped myself in a towel, quickly dried off, and opened the bathroom door. And that's when I bumped into Alex, who wasn't expecting me to still be there as he was about to enter. "Oh!" I exclaimed, stepping back, feeling my heart slam against my ribs. "Sorry," he said quickly, averting his gaze. "I thought you were done." "Yeah, it's fine." I didn't know what to say, feeling my cheeks flush with embarrassment. He stood there for a couple of seconds, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, then, lowering his eyes, added, "I really didn't mean to." "I know," I replied, trying to smile, but inside I felt a knot tighten. He went into the bathroom, and I returned to the room, feeling even more uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. And it wasn't just an accidental encounter. The next morning, our parents suggested we go on a tour of the local sites. It was a chance to distract ourselves, to escape the tense atmosphere in the room, where each night turned into a challenge. We gathered our things and headed to meet the guide, who promised to show us the most beautiful spots along the coast. "How's the vacation going?" Mom asked, giving me a warm glance as we walked towards the minibus. "Everything's great," I replied, forcing a smile. The sea, the sun, what more could I ask for? In reality, I had spent the whole morning trying to keep my distance from Alex. He acted like nothing was wrong, but I felt like everything had changed. Our accidental glances, awkward smiles, it all seemed to be becoming more noticeable with each passing day. But something inside me was too afraid to even consider what might be behind this tension. The guide was chatty and cheerful. He enthusiastically told us about ancient ruins, abandoned fortresses, and tiny fishing villages where we were headed. My parents were delighted, and I tried to focus on the scenery around us to stop thinking about what was going on. Alex also seemed distracted, snapping pictures of every interesting landscape with his phone. But when our eyes met at one of the stops, that familiar spark of awkwardness flickered between us again. I felt a knot of tension tighten inside. We quickly looked away, pretending nothing had happened, but the feeling that something had changed between us grew stronger with each passing minute. When we arrived at a small seaside village, our parents decided to have lunch at a local cafe, while I stayed by the water with Alex. We stood there watching the fishermen return with their catch. The sea was calm, the waves gently rolling onto the shore, creating an illusion of peace that I just couldn't feel. "Strange day, huh?" Alex suddenly said, breaking the silence. I looked at him. His voice was quiet, almost drowned out by the sound of the waves. "Yeah," I replied shortly, unsure of what else to say. "We're barely talking," he added, frowning slightly. "Is it because of yesterday?" "No," I quickly lied, but I knew that wasn't true. We both fell silent again, staring out at the endless expanse of water, until our parents returned. But that brief conversation left me with even more questions. It felt like every moment we spent together only made things more complicated. In the evening, we returned to the hotel exhausted but satisfied. Our parents joked a lot during dinner, reminiscing about the day's adventures. "How was today?" Dad asked, leaning back in his chair and savoring a glass of local wine. Wonderful, Mom replied enthusiastically. Those landscapes, and the sea like a mirror. Alex nodded, but I noticed his attention was focused on me. His gaze was too intent, too observant. I tried to keep my emotions in check and concentrate on the meal, but with every passing minute, it became harder to ignore the fact that something strange and unbearably tense was happening between us. Yeah, it was a great day, Alex added quietly, but his voice sounded as if he wasn't talking about the scenery at all, but something more personal. At some point, our eyes met again, and I froze for a second. In that moment, time seemed to stop. Our eyes conveyed more than words could, but the closeness I felt was so wrong that I immediately looked away. My heart began to race. Honey, you're barely eating, Mom remarked, interrupting my thoughts. Is everything okay? Yes, of course. I quickly grabbed my fork and put a piece of fish in my mouth, though I had no appetite at all. I could still feel his gaze on me even when I wasn't looking at him. The atmosphere at the table suddenly became unbearably heavy, and I was terrified that our parents might notice something. When our hands accidentally brushed under the table, it felt like a jolt of electricity surged through me from that brief contact. I quickly pulled my hand away, trying not to reveal my unease, but inside, everything was turning upside down. So, any plans for tomorrow? Dad asked cheerfully, breaking the silence. Mom joined in the conversation, and I tried to engage, but my thoughts were already elsewhere. Alex sat across from me, and his presence weighed on me, as if he knew something that we both were trying hard to ignore. When we returned to the room, the awkwardness between us became almost palpable. I tried to keep myself busy getting ready for bed, pulling out my pajamas, going through my things, pretending everything was as usual. But the tension, like an invisible wall, refused to let go. Alex sat on the edge of the bed, silent for a while, staring at the floor. We need to talk, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze, not lifting my head, but inside everything tightened. About what? I asked, though I knew exactly where he was heading. About what's going on between us. His voice was calm, but I could hear traces of tension beneath the surface. You feel it too, right? I slowly turned to face him, unsure of how to respond. The question was direct, and there was no point denying the truth anymore. We both knew that something had shifted. It had been hanging in the air, growing with each passing day, every silence, every glance. But admitting it out loud felt like stepping into an unknown, from which there would be no return. Yes, I replied quietly, my voice trembling. But I don't know what to do about it. Alex lifted his eyes to meet mine, and in that moment, all the tension broke free. He moved closer, and our eyes locked. We were both standing on the edge of something unknown and dangerous. We can't just ignore this, he said, his voice more determined now. I can't. Every time I look at you, I know it's wrong, but it's stronger than me. His words felt like a confession, and I could feel my heart racing. I didn't know how to respond or what to say. My thoughts were tangled, but something deep inside me was pulling me toward him, like a magnet. I stood there, trying to find answers within myself, but instead I could only feel the distance between us shrinking. We can't, I started, but before I could finish, he was already too close. Alex reached out cautiously and gently took my wrist. His touch was soft, but there was something undeniably powerful behind it. I should have stopped him, stepped back, but instead, I found myself drawn in even closer. Our eyes met again, and in that moment, I realized that holding on to boundaries had become impossible. I know, he whispered, but his eyes revealed that he too couldn't stop. A moment later, he pulled me toward him, and we were so close that the distance between us ceased to matter. Everything became a blur in my mind, my heart pounding too loudly, and we both understood that this wasn't supposed to happen. But the tension that had been building over these past days had finally burst free. We were too close. So close that any effort to resist these feelings seemed futile. We both knew we had crossed a line, and in that moment, we realized that everything would be different now. We both understood that we had gone too far. But before we could truly grasp the weight of it, there was a sudden, sharp knock on the door. We jumped apart instantly, as if we had been caught red-handed. The knocking was insistent, and I felt my heart pound even harder, gripped by the fear of being discovered. "It's probably Dad," Alex whispered, his voice tense and almost hoarse. "What do we do?" I asked, unable to hide the panic creeping into my voice. The knock came again, louder this time. "One second," Alex called out, quickly moving toward the door. I hurriedly lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, trying to look relaxed, though inside I was a mess of nerves. Alex opened the door, and there stood my father. "Everything okay?" Dad asked, casting a glance around the room. "Your mom and I were wondering if something was wrong. You've been in here for a while." "Yeah, everything's fine," Alex replied calmly, though I could hear the slight tremor in his voice. "We're just tired from the tour. Thought we'd turn in early." Dad lingered for a few seconds, looking between the two of us, but he didn't seem to suspect anything unusual. "All right, get some rest. We'll see you at breakfast tomorrow," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but then decided against it. As soon as the door closed, I exhaled deeply, realizing how tense my breathing had been. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't believe how close we had come to being caught. Alex slowly returned to his side of the bed, sitting on the edge without saying a word. We both remained silent, fully aware of how close we had been to exposing ourselves. "That was way too close," I finally said quietly, still trying to calm the storm inside me. Alex nodded without turning to look at me. "I know," he muttered, rubbing his face with his hands. "We can't do this anymore." "We can't," I agreed, though even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if we could really stop. The knock at the door and my father's unexpected visit had been a wake-up call. We were playing with fire, and now we realized just how dangerous it had become. The next morning was strangely calm. As I woke up, it felt as though the weight of last night still hung between us, a silent warning. Both Alex and I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered in the air, almost tangible. During breakfast with our parents, I avoided meeting his gaze and stuck to talking only about the day ahead. Plans for the beach, souvenir shopping, and the upcoming excursion. But it didn't help. Every time his eyes accidentally met mine, I felt a surge of unease. "How did you sleep?" Mom suddenly asked, looking at me from across the table. Her voice was warm, as usual, but in that moment, it felt like a challenge. "Good," I replied too quickly for it to sound natural. Alex nodded and added, "Yeah, nothing special. We were just tired from yesterday." Thankfully, our parents didn't seem to notice the awkwardness, engrossed in their conversation about the next excursion. But I knew this pretense, this attempt to act normal, couldn't last long. Everything that had happened the night before hung over us like an enormous invisible wall that we both were trying to ignore. After breakfast, I suggested spending the day with our parents, hoping that being with them would help distract me and bring things back to normal. We headed to a market in a nearby town where they sold souvenirs, spices, and local crafts. At first, it helped. The noise of the market, the lively conversations, my parents' smiles, the heat of the day, everything distracted me for a while. We were walking down a narrow, sunlit street when Mom suddenly stopped at one of the stalls, intrigued by the ceramic goods on display. "How about this dish? I think it'd look nice in the kitchen," she asked me. I pretended to focus on the discussion about which plates to choose, though my thoughts kept drifting back to Alex, who stood quietly in the shade of a building, watching us. "Sure, let's get it," I nodded, barely paying attention to what we were picking. After we made our purchase, Alex stepped aside, glancing down the street. I walked over to him, trying to act as casually as possible. "Are you okay?" I asked, hoping my voice sounded light and natural. He looked at me, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed the tension he was holding inside. Not really, he admitted quietly, but I'm trying. That short exchange confirmed what we both already knew. Our efforts to act like nothing more than brother and sister were just an illusion. We both understood that there was no easy way to return to normal. That evening, after a long day spent with our parents, I felt drained, but it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was emotional. We had been trying to ignore what was happening between us, hoping that time and distance would somehow put everything back in its place. But the more we tried to suppress it, the stronger the pull between us became. The night had already settled over the coastline, and I stood on the balcony watching the ocean shimmer under the moonlight when Alex quietly came up beside me. We need to talk. His voice sounded serious, almost tired, as if he had made up his mind long ago to have this conversation. I knew this moment was inevitable. I nodded, not turning to look at him, and he stood next to me, staring at the waves. We can't keep doing this, he began, his head lowered. I can't pretend nothing is happening anymore. I gripped the balcony railing, feeling the anxiety build inside me. The words I had been avoiding were finally spoken. We were too far in to just forget everything, but too close to keep pretending. I feel it too, I admitted, my voice softer than I expected. But what can we do about it? Alex sighed deeply, as if he were trying to gather his thoughts. Then he looked me in the eyes, and I felt something inside me stir. I can't control how I feel about you, he confessed, his voice full of sincerity. I've tried to convince myself that this is wrong, that we should just be brother and sister. But it's not working. I turned away from him, feeling my emotions flare up again. I had tried to suppress my feelings too, convincing myself that it was just temporary tension because of our closeness, because we were sharing a room. But with each passing day, it had become harder to ignore. I know, I replied, meeting his gaze. But this will destroy us. It will destroy our family. We both understood that. We weren't naive teenagers. We were fully aware of how complicated and dangerous the situation was. There were not only moral boundaries, but also family ties, responsibilities to our parents, and the fear that our actions could hurt those we cared about. But what do you do when feelings become stronger than reason? I don't know how to stop this, he said, his voice trembling. But I can't just walk away from you, no matter how much I want to. I froze, looking at him. There was a truth in his words that I couldn't ignore either. We were both trapped by these feelings that neither of us could escape. But did we have the right to act on them? Or were we doomed to live in this endless pretense, with stolen glances and fleeting touches that spoke louder than words? We have to try, Alex, I said, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. We have to stop this. There was a silence between us, thick with everything we had been trying to push away. The waves crashed softly in the distance, their rhythm a stark contrast to the turmoil inside us. We knew the line we had crossed, and we knew the consequences. But standing there, side by side, it was clear that this wouldn't be easy. It was a battle between the heart and the mind, and neither of us was certain which would win. The silence lingered, filled with the unspoken truth that stopping this might be just as hard as continuing it. After that conversation, a long, heavy silence followed. We both stood on the balcony, lost in our thoughts. The soft wind from the sea gently tousled my hair, and the sound of the waves seemed to underscore the chaos within us. I glanced at Alex, and in his eyes, I saw a mix of pain and regret, but also a firm resolve. We both knew we were on the edge, where any wrong move could destroy everything. You're right, he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. This has to end. I nodded, feeling a tight knot in my stomach. It was the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. We were bound not just by what we felt for each other, but by the boundaries we couldn't cross. Family was more important. Our parents didn't know what had been happening between us, and that was our only saving grace. We had to stop before it was too late. We just need to be family, I said, trying to infuse my words with more confidence than I felt. Otherwise, this will destroy everything. Alex nodded. He understood. Maybe he had understood from the start, but until this moment, neither of us had the courage to say it out loud. We both looked out at the sea, hoping to find in its calm waters the answers to the questions spinning in our minds. "I'll move to another room," he suggested, breaking the silence. "We can tell our parents it's more comfortable that way. It'll give us the space we need right now." I looked at him. It was the most sensible solution. Alex moving to a different room was a symbol of the distance we needed to create between us, to try to bring things back to normal. Maybe, with time, these feelings would fade, or at least slip into the background, making way for what really mattered. "Yeah, that's a good idea," I agreed. "We need time for everything to settle down." We both knew this wasn't a solution, just an attempt to delay facing the problem. But we didn't have any other option. When we went back into the room, the atmosphere had already shifted. We were no longer prisoners of our emotions. We had made a decision. The next morning, Alex packed his things and moved to another room, giving the excuse that he wanted more space. Our parents didn't suspect anything. They accepted it calmly and even with a bit of happiness, thinking it would be more comfortable for us that way. When the door closed behind Alex, I felt a sense of relief. But at the same time, there was an empty feeling left inside me. We had made the right choice. We chose family. But despite that, I knew a part of me would always remember this moment. A few days had passed since Alex moved to a different room. On the surface, everything seemed to return to normal. We continued our vacation with our parents, going to the beach, taking tours, and having dinner together like before. I tried to spend more time with my mom, talking about trivial things, looking for new places to visit. But inside, I couldn't shake a strange feeling of emptiness. Alex and I barely spoke. Not because of any obvious hostility or awkwardness, but because of the chasm we had built between us. He kept his distance, and while I knew it was the right thing to do, every time our eyes accidentally met, I felt a tremor inside me, like a storm that hadn't fully settled. I caught myself looking for him among people, trying to find out where he was, what he was doing in every conversation. This feeling became particularly sharp during our dinners. Alex remained the same cheerful and attentive son to our parents, but to me, he had become a stranger. One evening, as I sat on the balcony, I heard the door to his new room open and close. Alex had returned from a walk on the beach. Again, I found myself thinking about him more than I should. "We need to be family," I repeated to myself, but the feelings didn't fade as quickly as I wanted them to. They were still there, buried deep but very much alive. A few minutes later, the door to the balcony creaked open and Alex appeared beside me. He looked tired, but there was a strange mixture of resolve and sadness in his eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said, avoiding my gaze. "What?" I asked, feeling anxiety rise within me. He sighed heavily, then looked at me. "I'm leaving earlier than I planned," he said calmly, though I could hear the sadness in his voice. "I think it'll be better for both of us. I spoke to our parents, told them I have work that needs my attention." My reaction was instant. I felt something inside me snap. "You're leaving? Seriously?" There was confusion in my voice. "Yes, I know it's the right thing to do. We're too close and it's only making things harder. Time apart will help us both," he said, his decision firm. I didn't know how to respond. Everything made sense, it was the logical thing to do, but the feeling of loss hit me again. I understood he was doing the right thing, that this was what we had decided, to stop. But the thought of his leaving for good, of the distance becoming real rather than symbolic, suddenly made it all painful. "Okay," I said, masking the storm of emotions behind that one word. "It's probably the right decision." Alex nodded quietly, and then, after a brief pause, added, "I'll always be here if you ever need anything. We're still family, but for now we need this distance." With that, he left, leaving me alone on the balcony. I gazed out at the shimmering ocean, listening to the sound of the waves, and realized that from this moment on, our relationship had truly changed. We had made the right choice. But that choice carried with it the weight of consequences we would both have to live with. After Alex left, it seemed like everything fell back into place, at least outwardly. My parents noticed his absence, but they accepted his decision calmly, with understanding, even a bit of relief. His work was important to him, and no one asked any probing questions. I, too, didn't show my emotions. On the outside, I was the same as always, smiling, laughing with my parents, enjoying the remaining days by the coast. But inside, things felt entirely different. I had thought that each day spent apart from Alex would make it easier, and I tried to convince myself of this. We had made the right decision, set the right priorities. But time didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. Instead, the emptiness I felt when he left only grew. It was as if a part of me had left with him, and no walks along the beach or ocean sunrises could fill that void. Returning home was quiet. We made our way to the airport, and I tried to distract myself with conversation, but thoughts of Alex followed me. Once we were back home, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Work, friends, the hobbies I once enjoyed, all felt like distractions, mere escapes from reality. Every day I became more aware of how deeply his absence affected me. One evening, as I sat on the couch, mindlessly watching TV, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Alex. I froze, staring at the screen, hesitating to open it. My heart started to race, and I felt the old pain and emotions resurface with renewed force. "How are you?" It was a short, simple message, but it triggered a flood of memories. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time before deciding to reply. My fingers trembled as I typed my response. "Fine. How are you?" His reply came almost immediately. "I'm okay, but I miss you."